Hello, my friends. I'm sorry to keep restarting on you, and I'm sorry for our delays, but you can imagine in a household with 10 every day, finding even 15 minutes of undisturbed quiet can be difficult. Today, friends, we're going to look at the book, The McDonaldization of the Church, Consumer Culture and the Church's Future by Professor John Drane. John Drane is the head of practical theology at the Divinity School of Aberdeen University and the author of several books dealing with faith and culture. But this book specifically looks at the consumer culture and how that relates to the church. And I have to say that when I approached this project, when I selected this book, I came with my own preconceived ideas of what to expect. I mean, after all, let's admit, there's been a fair amount of discussion around the images of fast food and culture. There's been a good deal of research and discussion about how the advent of fast food in American culture has shaped our understanding and our expectations. And so, I came expecting to hear the same rhetoric about how, since the introduction of the microwave oven, we have become a society that simply does not know how to wait. We want everything now. Reminded of the character from the Willy Wonka films, the young girl who was so spoiled that the only phrase she repeated to her father again and again is, "I want it now, I want it now." And that's really where we've landed as a culture here in America. We really don't know how to wait. And if this was going to be another discourse on the demands of immediately in our culture, if it was not going to be that, it certainly was going to be a discussion of our self-centered approach to life, still reminding me of the same character. After all, wasn't it McDonald's that taught us that we deserve a break today, and that they would do it all for us? And wasn't it fast food that espoused "have it your way"? A different chain, I know, but the same self-serving message anyway. But what I discovered, what pleasantly surprised me, was that while the book did indeed begin with a problematic view of American culture, its approach, specifically McDonaldization, was nothing that I had researched or read or even pondered before. Drawing on the work of sociologist Dr. Reitzer, who wrote The McDonaldization of Society, John Drane explained that this McDonaldization, he explained it as the resulting mechanizing of our culture. In other words, we have learned from the fast food industry that the most productive way to solve any problem, to meet any demand, is to break it down into a simple, repeatable process. Efficient, reproducible, predictable, routine. If you want to make a good hamburger, if you want it to be consistent and predictable, then you divide a step-by-step process that, once followed, even the most underskilled employee can repeat correctly. So effective was this approach that it seeped into almost every aspect of our culture. Dr. Reitzer's McDonaldization consists of 4 major factors or functions that, in and of themselves, are not necessarily bad, but an overemphasis in any one, or in the worst case, all of these factors, results in this negative sense of mechanization. Those 4 factors are efficiency, calculability or countability, in other words, the numbers, predictability, and control. Each of these has their place and their function in creating a successful outcome, even in the church. I mean, we talk about efficiency, and in the church, that's not a bad thing in and of itself. We need to find efficient ways to handle situations. After all, we work with volunteers and limited budgets, and so efficiency is something that we need to keep in mind. Calculability is the inevitable part, especially if you're in a denominational structure that once reports on membership and worship attendance and how many baptisms and professions of faith you've had in a year's time. How many weddings, how many deaths. Numbers are certainly a part of the process, and they serve their purpose. Predictability has its place. I mean, people do want to know what to expect when they come to church. They don't necessarily want to be surprised in outlandish kind of ways. And as human beings, we all have a need for some sense of being in control. Nobody likes to be completely out of control. So in and of themselves, each of the factors serve their place. The problem comes when we're talking, and what we're talking about here is about an overconcentration of focus. And according to Drane, when that happens, we see the negative effects of that overconcentration or overfocus in the church as well. We've so formulated our approach to church and spirituality that we have it systematized. We've mechanized the life and the spirit right out of the thing. Drane begins his work by attempting to set the stage, as it were. He goes to great lengths to help his reader to get a clear picture of the current conditions of the church. He writes this: "The facts about the church can hardly be disputed. Throughout the Western world, Christianity has fallen on hard times. No matter how they are reported or reinterpreted, the statistics of church attendance and membership all paint the same picture, right across all denominations and theological persuasions." He goes on to say that it is impossible to deny or otherwise redefine the obvious fact that all the historic mainline denominations are struggling. Sadly, he concludes by saying, more than that, some Protestant groups in particular appear to have no future at all. He blames this state in no small part on the McDonaldization of the church. Church, according to Drane, has become a mechanized cultural experience and routine rather than a living, breathing body of Christ. Gone from it is any experiences of life or the truly spiritual. He contrasts this with the overwhelming empirical evidence that we are experiencing a tremendous surge in personal seeking. People are seeking an encounter with the authentically spiritual. And there's a growing yet undefined hunger of all things that are spiritual on a personal level, though not necessarily in a corporate understanding, because of this routinization, this McDonaldization of the church. The problem, according to Drane, is that we are caught in what he calls the iron cage of a mechanized, McDonaldized approach to the church that is lifeless and devoid of true spirituality. It is meaningless and boring to the postmodern culture. It simply does not speak to them. We are out of touch and unrelatable. Our routines and our predictability have created a sense of that was my parents' church or my grandparents' church. At one point, he points to the statistics on generational reproduction. He highlights the fact that the church cannot even make itself meaningful and relatable to those who have grown up in the church. We are losing the next generation of the church. And further, he asks this question. He says, if we cannot be meaningful to those who have grown up within our churches, how can we ever hope to reach those who have never experienced church? Drane goes on from here to attempt to give the reader an understanding of the major cultural groups that the church needs to find ways to relate to, those factions and parts of postmodern culture. He divides into 7 major cultural sectors or people. While he does concede that these are somewhat arbitrary and simplistic, given that most people cannot fit neatly into these categories, I found his approach to be one that is probably one of the most helpful assertions of the book. His groupings are these: the desperate poor, the hedonist, the traditionalist, the spiritual seekers, mostly New Age phenomenon, although Drane says he hesitates to use that title, the corporate achievers, the secularist, and finally the apathetic. Each group has, according to Drane, the potential to be reached by the church. However, reaching each group will require customizing a customized and a highly individualized approach. What we need to do is find a voice that speaks to each group. For instance, he says that reaching the desperate poor might just mean that the majority of mainline churches will have to admit that it is entirely possible that specialized ministries may do a better job, and that what really we would be best served in doing would be finding ways to support them prayerfully and financially. He does, however, conclude by stating that it is not entirely impossible to imagine a way of being church that empowers the poor. He cites the examples of early Methodism and of the Salvation Army, which William Booth came out of, the Methodist tradition. in England. But he does say that this is going to take that same type of radical rethinking. It's going to take someone who says, what we do does not speak, and so we must find a new way. And in our current standing, he says that it is these specialized ministries that take that as their specific call that do that best. But that he does not say that it's impossible for the church. I like that he says it is possible to imagine a way of the church, of being the church that empowers the poor. Of the hedonist, Drane writes this, and I love the way he wrote this, so I just want to read it to you. He said, an effective spirituality for those attracted to the hedonist lifestyle. The party animal. My ad. He says, that effective spirituality for those attracted to the hedonist lifestyle will have to be an embodied spirituality. It'll have to be one, he says, which can understand play as worship, and one that sees the kingdom of God as a party. Almost by definition, therefore, he says, they will not be reached by a church that meets in the regular way on Sunday mornings. In fact, he says, probably not by one that meets in the morning at all. The traditionalists, the next group, he says, according to Drane, are those who really are happy with the way things are. Now, he's very clear to say that the traditionalists are not happy with the way the church is in its current state, especially in its current decline. He says what they are happy with is the status quo. What church does now speaks to them. And he cautions that what we need to do is find a way to reimagine what is traditional in a way that speaks in postmodern culture. That is using his words, a little less booky. According to Drane, the spiritual seekers are those that the church has the most potential to reach, this next group. They are the persons most open and most receptive to a personal experience of the spiritual. He says, however, paradoxically, that these will actually be among the hardest for the church to reach, because reaching them is going to require the church to open itself up to a far different understanding of spirituality than it's accustomed to. He says reaching the spiritual seeker will require a great deal of out-of-the-box thinking, and it will require a redefining and a reinterpreting of what we call spirituality. Drane goes on to make similar observations about the remaining groups, each group requiring its own individually targeted approach, each one unique and yet all in need of this out-of-the-box approach. The church needs to rediscover its flexibility, he says. Now, if Drane had stopped there, it may have proven a helpful enough book. However, he went on to talk about other areas within the life of the church that one can see the effects of McDonaldization touching. He talked about the McDonaldization of worship and the worship wars. He discussed the mechanized understanding of success requiring any measure of failure to have a scapegoat, someone to blame. However, our need for success has also driven us to the blame game within the worshiping structures of the church. If the congregation is not finding the worship meaningful, then the organist blames the choir, and the choir blames the untrained musicians blame the organist, and so you create this cycle of blame, and nothing ever really gets addressed. He says that this routinized understanding of worship has made it less an experience of the spiritual and far more performance-based. And I can certainly understand his assertions there. Drane also talked about the McDonaldization of leadership. This is an understanding that focuses on the trained professional as the spiritual leader, the one who imparts deeply hidden and thoroughly exegeted truths to this uneducated mass, rather than the biblical model that focuses on the priesthood of all believers, which, as we know, is the understanding that gifts are given to all of the members of the body for the building up of the whole of the church. He even discussed McDonaldization present in things as seemingly mundane as space and furniture. Things that, upon deeper scrutiny, reveal power dynamics that foster a separation between leader and follower, and that subliminally reinforce a sense of hierarchy, of us and them, of me and you. We McDonaldize our congregation into a hierarchical structure of who sits where and who's earned the right to sit here or there. And yet all of it is separate. Even the pulpit, he says, is a statement of power, of one who is in the know, imparting to those who are not. All of this was the real meat for me, the real strengths of Drane's work. Rather than approach these complex issues with simple formulated answers, and Lord knows the church has suffered at the hands of countless what I call snake oil remedies for its decline. Instead of using these simple snake oil formulated answers, he instead works to shine a light on the effects of McDonaldization upon the church. Rather than propose his own self-help styled 12-step program, The Church Renewal, he encourages readers to examine the issues that he highlights, and using some simple examples of how it has been effective in other places, the reader is left to think through the application for his or herself, to ask themselves the questions: how does this touch where I minister and where I do church, or where we are being church, as he says. Now, if the work has a weakness, it, for me, lies in the author's use of cultural understandings that are clearly British in reference. If this McDonaldization is truly a global phenomenon within the church, or even a Northern Hemisphere church issue, then it would seem to me that a more cross-cultural exemplification might be warranted. He ties his examples of successful cross-group ministry to the death of Princess Diana, which certainly touched American culture, but in no way was it the cultural phenomenon that it was in Britain. He approached the problem from a perspective of the Scottish church, and while he does draw on some American cultural iconography, this comes across at best as an afterthought to appeal to an American audience. So finally, friends, I know we're running long, so I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about application, especially in my own setting. Interestingly enough, even though my church is set in small coal mining community in rural western Pennsylvania, as I was reading, I was able to identify each of the groups in my community that Drane delineated. I know, at least to some degree, who are the desperate poor in my community. I know the secularists, the traditionalists, the spiritual seekers, and I can certainly identify the apathetic and the hedonist. However, as I spent a little more time reading and thinking about each group, suddenly faces of persons within my congregation came to mind. Each disillusioned for different reasons, but all feeling like the church is not connecting with them as they would hope. I can see the faces of the secularist and the traditionalist, of the spiritual seeker and the apathetic. I can identify the desperate poor and the hedonist. Drane's work opened my eyes to just how pervasive McDonaldization, of this mechanization, this routinization, this predictability really is. Just how insidious it can become. It's not only an out there problem. It's not something that is just an issue for evangelism, for the people outside. It is also an in-here one as well. Our churches are full of closet hedonists and spiritual seekers who feel disconnected or unsatisfied. We've got the apathetic who just don't care, and we've got the cultural success seekers who are looking, are so busy in their life to make a success and make the best of their life that church is just a predictable piece that fits in on Sunday mornings. And so I was left thinking that it would take creativity and imagination and a good deal of out-of-box thinking and deliberateness to reach both those within the walls and those outside of the doors. And that's going to take a very mechanized approach. And then there are the issues of McDonaldized worship in space. I'm left thinking, what would it look like to worship outside of the sanctuary? What if we set a worship space in, say, the fellowship hall? What if the church were set up as church in the round? All exciting possibilities, and yet always remembering the traditionalists as well. My one caution is always with these types of thoughts, and that is when we are talking about thinking outside of the box, we cannot forget those who are still inside the box. There are those among us who, the traditionalists mostly, who for them, the way we currently do church is deeply satisfying. We cannot simply change everything and not maintain at least some semblance of the worship experience that speaks so deeply to them. We can't throw out the baby with the proverbial bathwater, so to speak. All in all, friends, I think this book is an excellent read. A clear, well thought out, and presented evaluation of the church and its relationship with the greater consumer culture in which we live, especially in America. I encourage you, read it for yourself, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you, and God bless.